So on today's Hoffman Reed Lessons in Leadership, we have Oli Randell. Oli is the Managing Director and owner of Active EMS. Oli, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much for inviting me on.
Oli, I think the first question I ask everybody is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? How have you got to where you are today, and how you ended up in sort of the hot seat that you're in?
Well, to be absolutely honest, it was slightly by accident, although there was design. I'd had a career in big corporate. I'd had a career which had finance and accounting backgrounds. I got to a point in my career where I traveled a lot, and I remember being in a hotel in Rotterdam, sitting there thinking, well, hold on, this wasn't the plan. And I reminded myself the plan was to live and work in the same city, walk to work and pick up a latte. So I just decided that I needed to change up, and part of that decision was, unless I start out on my own, unless I start my own business, I'm always potentially going to be asked to go overseas or do something that hadn't been in the plan by someone else. And I'd seen that a lot with my colleagues I'd worked in Nestle, big corporate. So I decided to go on my own. I decided to do an MBA, started out in sort of more of a contracting environment, which eventually went through some venture capital and business angel activity. That I then started my own consulting firm called Local Business Partners. We had a specialist in finance, HR, and marketing. We felt that was a sort of a market gap, a market opportunity, although in sort of like 2009, 10, 11, there was a lot of money that came from, I suppose, government money that came in with the Growth Accelerator and those type of programs, that it was probably a good idea at the wrong time. And there's an awful lot of the non-exec style introductory businesses coming up now, which is very, very similar in principle. Small businesses that should have those leadership specialists within the business. And I got a phone call from Brian Sloan saying there's a firm that is closing, that if it had maybe a new management team to be able to take it over, it could survive and thrive. And that's what led us to where we are now.
So tell us a little bit about Active EMS for those of us who might not necessarily have come across the business before.
Sure. So we manufacture or assemble electronic products, and those electronic products are ones that are the designs are primarily owned by, or they are entirely owned by our clients. Often they're actually designed by our clients, unless they come to us and ask for us to design them for them. So an example, one it interacts a lot with an industry that you know well, is automotive telematic for the car insurance industry. We're quite a large, we have a large position in that market, but we also produce products that charge iPads and iPhones and sensors for forklift truck batteries and all number of different industry products.
So you've had an interesting career path. You've done large corporate, you're an entrepreneur, you're now running a decent sized business. What would you say has been the biggest challenge through that period, and what are the lessons you've learned doing that?
I suppose the biggest lesson was learning to just be me, and learning, building that self-awareness, because, at the end of the day, a business is a group of people with a common objective. So for me, that was getting that clarity around, those culture and values first, and then trying to build a team and a people and a business and even clients around those common purpose and those common values. I think life is much easier when you've got that clarity. And I'm now in my mid-40s, and I was having dinner with my best friend last night, and we were talking about how we felt in our mid-20s and how complete and rounded we felt. And we probably realise now that we're on even as much, if not more, of a learning journey now than we were in our 20s. So I suppose that continuous learning, that continuous development, not being afraid to take on new ideas, all of those. And so I think it's quite, soft skill orientated rather than sort of numeric or hard KPI driven for how we progressed.
I think that's interesting, and you talked about values and being more rounded. I think I'm definitely more rounded than I was in my 20s, but I think I'm referring to my physical shape there, as well as my
No, I know the feeling.
as well as my mental capability. But you talked a lot about values and having common values. Can you talk to us a little bit more about that and what that means to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, I I've built quite a strong understanding myself. I'm quite a logic-based profile, but and actually the function of the organization, it's very process-led. So actually finding a good fit between you and your activity, and also with the team, and as we've grown as a team, and we'll probably talk about it in a little bit in a moment, one of the sort of the foundation elements of the business that we actually bought out a former Remploy factory, and the Remploy factory had a focus on disability employment. I think it's fair to say that we've evolved to be as much inclusion and diversity with a disability interest, shall we say. And often when we do introductions to the factory and when we do factory tours, I come to a part of the factory where I talk about a process where I ask the question of all the characteristics you could think of in individuals, what could help you to be high performing on this activity? And I don't expect anyone to have the same answer that I do, but one of the answers that I come out with is that in this task, we've got people that are profoundly deaf and other people that have autism, and actually they're real high performers in that activity. The people that are profoundly deaf have high levels of concentration, attention, and focus. The individuals who have autism almost look at it almost as a jigsaw puzzle. And in doing that activity, I would describe them as being, almost hyper performers, because you've got the right person to activity fit. So I kind of have a real thought and mindset that we have, we're all unique. We all have, our own capabilities, and it's really about finding the environment in which you'll thrive. And I once used to describe myself as being like I had a shopping trolley full of characteristics and capabilities and skills, and they were all jumbled up in a shopping trolley. And what I needed to do was take them out and almost, work out what the recipe was that I could use those skills with, and what I could make with them. And I suppose it was somewhat fortuitous as to where I've ended up. But I found that actually the business that we run now is a really, really good fit to how my brain works, sort of my interests, and it certainly makes life easier if you can sort of fit your environment really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you you touched on the whole diversity and inclusion piece there, and disability, and you talked about creating that perfect recipe of person to culture fit. How have you gone about doing that, and how have you kind of fostered that within your organization?
I suppose one of the elements is that quite early on in as early as possible within the business, I suppose this comes from having created local business partners. First of all, I realized that I'm not an expert on everything. I know where my strengths lie, but I need to also know where my circle of competence is, and where I need to bring in people that are experts and specialists. So we've done quite well to build a management team, build a board beyond that, to use, for example, an independent HR consultant who works with us on a day rate basis. We've got a specialist marketing consultant. I've got a CTO who's an industry, probably an industry leading expert. And we were very, very lucky that we can hire him on a pay-as-you-go basis, because he works for a number of other different environments. Although I keep joking that he comes to our Christmas party, but he doesn't go to the Christmas party of all of his clients. But sort of building that group around you, and that skill sets, and almost being sort of quite open and transparent, and as you kind of work together, but also trying to put some system and process around that as well. And I suppose they've been the key traits of our development.
And you talked about Remploy, so and purchasing a sort of Remploy factory. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's not something that all our listeners or our viewers will know about. So perhaps if you could talk to us a little bit about that and some of the issues that brought along and some of the benefits that you gained from that organisation.
Yeah, I suppose there's certain elements that I'll just have to be a little bit cautious around speaking about. But primarily, Remploy was a business that was run by the Department of Work and Pensions. There was a decision that had been made many years prior. This is it wasn't relevant to any one government of the time. It was made, I think, in the previous government to the timing that. Unfortunately, the loss making of the Remploy organisations and the group was unsustainable, and someone had obviously made a decision that I suppose the individuals that wouldn't find employment elsewhere, and the economic cost of social care in their eyes wouldn't be as high as the losses that the organisation was making. I guess that was the decision was made. And when we came along, I mean, we were probably very, very late to the process, far too late. There was already 16 skips that were ordered for the car park to trash all of the equipment and clear it out. I wasn't ever told this, but I'm pretty sure the business plan was, sell the property, use the property sales to kind of pay for the closure costs, and then support the individuals going forwards. But obviously, I think that misses, one of the fundamental points of how valuable, having, a work environment can be. And I suppose it also shows that sometimes, government-run organisations have a different approach to private and commercial-run organisations, because I went in there and I did a tour, and I sort of asked some very simple questions when I first went in and said, so what's happening here? And we found out that the property was being, costed out at a rate that was nearly double the market rate. And we found out that the landlord was also the Department of Work and Pensions. That was a transfer pricing issue. We found that the business was manufacturing products at a price point that was, unsustainable. And I asked, well, what's the product that's being manufactured? So actually it's a panic alarm. And one of the clients is the NHS, or the client for this product is the NHS. So that's a transfer pricing issue. But also, unfortunately, they were structured with far too big a resource pool than they had the activity to run. And they also had an off-site management team in Essex that the local Bolton factory, didn't see on a daily basis. So actually, by solving some of those issues, by effectively bringing in a team that had myself as full-time, but other individuals that were on a part-time basis, but as specialists, we were then able to kind of right-size the management team. There was quite an aging workforce, I think it was fair to say. So, but we unfortunately couldn't take everyone along with us at the time, because there was 54 members of staff in that factory, and we had enough work for 7 at the outset. And the business had obviously they'd made virtually they made all the members of staff redundant. So we had to restart from scratch. And actually, they're told all of the existing clients that they weren't going to operate. So we had to start from scratch with finding work and activity as well. So if I'm honest, I mean, sometimes I look back and ask the question, if I knew what I knew now, would I have done it? I think the answer is probably yes, but I might have scared myself out of it. I remember, just going off tack quickly, I remember being in I was coaching a program at the Manchester Business School on venture capital, and one of the individuals who runs a venture capital fund sort of asked all the students, what's your number? In other words, or how much do you need to raise to go from 0 to break even? And I think he suggested, I can't remember if it was £500,000 or £1 million. And I was sort of like saying, oh, shh, don't say that, because you're going to put them off. It's almost like, don't tell someone the journey that they're going to have to go on and the challenges they're going to have to go on, because maybe if you knew about those challenges in advance, you would be almost too prepared for the fear, rather than just be in the moment and having to, I suppose, cope. And I suppose it's almost like, I know you've had a family not that long ago. and I don't have children myself, but I'm sure you'd say that, you know, are any parents ever sort of fully ready for the baby coming along? Are they, you know, there's no real training, is there? There's no real training manual. As much as you can read, as much as you like. I think to a certain extent, running a business has some of those elements, is that you can only be so prepared, but actually being kind of adaptable and, you know, resilient is, you know, I think half of the battle. And if we were told half of the journey that we were going to go through in advance, I don't know whether I would have been as sort of stoic and resilient knowing that in advance. Each challenge as you come up, you deal with it, you get over, and you maybe don't expect the next one, but you cope with it as it comes along.
No, absolutely. And I like the parenting analogy. I know there's no guidebook for parenting. I read Commando Dad for any new parents out there who are looking for something to read beforehand, and that's quite interesting, by a former Royal Marines commando who who took to parenting, and it's quite funny and but quite useful as a manual. But I don't think I've ever found one of those for running a business.
Yeah, I think each business, like, you know, each child, they have their own unique characteristics, and it's very difficult to predict in advance, you know, how that will potentially evolve. I suppose, you know, we live in a complex system, don't we? A complex adaptive system. So as to how each day will pan out, and it's, you know, there's so much you can do in terms of prediction and planning, and the, you know, the larger you get as an organization, the more predictable it becomes, and the more, you know, you can forecast and plan. I suppose, especially in those early days and those early stages, is, you know, I think there's being resilient and adaptable and you know, I suppose seeing it all through is, you know, it's just quite critical as part of how you develop.
Absolutely. And you've talked there about some sort of leadership issues. What would you say is a key indicator for you that your leadership style is becoming less effective, and how do you then go about remedying that?
I suppose the obvious thing to say for me, I mean, I from a business point of view, grew up in a finance and accounting background, and obviously your mindset at that time is drawn very much into facts and figures and measures and revenue and profitability. And, you know, I suppose the textbook would start saying you need to look at whether you've got absence around you know, staff members and delays in terms of reordering from clients. But to be honest with you, it's really, you know, the softer indicators. Are you having, you know, potentially retaining the attention of your staff and your clients and your suppliers? Are you sort of like having the same level of engagement, and, you know, do you really sense the same level of trust? And I suppose, you know, you do go through hard times. You do go through times when you realize that maybe, you know, the communication has been, you know, it's waned a little bit, and you've maybe had more of a head down, you know, solutions orientation. But I suppose you just have to keep making sure that you've got your eyes and ears open, and you're sort of constantly being, you know, aware. And I suppose also having clarity around, you know, your culture and values and your beliefs, and making sure that you keep pulling yourselves back to that mindset, and again having that board around you to challenge and ask those questions, and to be there to sort of share, and having that transparency will give you inputs and information. The worst thing to do is to think you can do it all on your own, and, you know, try and you know, run without others around you. I know that, again, when we were developing local business partners, what we realized is that something like over 90% of businesses in the UK are sub 1 million, nearly something like 95% are sub 2 million turnover. So there are a really large proportion of businesses that haven't evolved from you know, the micro small level through to the medium. And I think that development, that chasm, and crossing that chasm is very much down to whether you can build the management team around, especially if, you know, founder-led organizations. If you can build that management team, you can go across that chasm. But I think without that, you reach a natural limit in terms of how many people can one person sort of cope with in terms of interactions. I suppose I've spoken to you many times about, you know, manager subordinate relationships in call centers are a good example. You know, you have one supervisor can probably cope with about 10, 12, maybe in some circumstances 15 people as a manager subordinate relationship. And it's the same in a business. Once you get to that level, I think that's where you top out and the complexity tops out. And if you don't have the management team and you don't develop past that, then that becomes almost, you start to actually feel a lot of the stresses and strains, and I suppose businesses start to back off then once you go sort of beyond that level.
I think you're right, and there was some academic research, and I can't remember where it came out of now. It's so long since I last read it, but I think the optimum number is somewhere between 5 and 8 direct reports. Yeah. After which it starts to become noticeable in terms of drop off into with productivity and capability.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I suppose the other element is, you know, you've got to work out what you can be a specialist in, what you are highly capable in, and then really it's about hiring good people that are specialists in the other areas and predominantly getting out of their way. I think there's a kind of a perception through, you know, Dragon's Den and all these other business programs that we're watching that, you know, business owners wear capes, and I really don't think that's the case at all. And actually, sometimes I think that you know, almost perception out to the future business owners and business leaders, the people that want to start their own businesses, it's the wrong perception. You know, actually it's all about getting other people around you. That's the most important thing, rather than trying to do it all yourself.
Which brings me nicely into a question I like to ask people about: which leaders do you admire, and why do you admire them?
My number one is Warren Buffett. I've studied him for 20 years. I've been following him. You know, Berkshire Hathaway. I can't, you know, I really love kind of almost the essence of the person. And if you you know, read or watch anything with Warren Buffett, he virtually from the get-go talks about, you know, reputations and relationships are far more valuable commodities than revenue and profitability over the long term. So he talks about how you can build you know, build a brand and build trust over 20 years and destroy it in 20 minutes. And he says that when you look at hiring people, look for intelligence, energy, and integrity. But he says, be warned that if you miss the last one, the first two are dangerous. So if you hire for intelligence and energy, but not integrity, you know, woe betide, and the results you'll get from that.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about COVID then, Oli. So obviously COVID's probably been one of the biggest issues affecting most leaders around the world. Yeah. How did you transition, especially as a manufacturing business? And how did you cope with COVID, and what measures did you kind of put in place to ensure that the business not only survives but thrives moving forward?
Yeah. Well, first of all, to be honest with you, when the announcement came out in March 2020 about the first lockdown, I was actually in the States. So my wife and I were already over there. I think, you know, we forget at the time that there was such a limited amount of information and we couldn't foresee what eventually became. So, you know, straight away I was highly dependent on the team and the other leaders that I had back in the UK with the business. And I suppose that was the ultimate test, that in a pandemic, we didn't fall apart. I suppose that's one thing to be, you know, highly, highly proud of. And even when I came back to the UK, I couldn't, you know, couldn't go back to the factory. I had to self-isolate for 2 weeks, and that was incredibly frustrating. But when I did get back with the team, you know, I was incredibly grateful at how quickly, you know, the other leaders within the team had got together PPE, got together process. We were temperature checking every single, twice a day with every single member of staff. We were segregated. We had all the PPE, hand sanitizer, masks. So we'd got really quickly with the process, which obviously being a process-led business, I'm sort of, you know, very grateful that we had that. But even from then, it was very, you know, early on, it was very easy to see that I think the mental health and mindset would play a really big part. And I remember sort of having we used to have meetings outside in the car park so that we could be relatively close together, but still, you know, stand sort of safely. I remember saying to the team, rather than sort of like preaching as to what I thought they should do, I was just talking about what I'm doing individually. And I remember saying, you know, we're not going to get everything right. There's going to be mistakes, but as long as we trust that we're all trying to do the right thing and we keep talking from a business point of view, you know, that's the best we can do. But also I remember quite early on just watching the news and just thinking there's so much negativity and, you know, quite harrowing news articles about this that I had to, you know, stop watching, to be honest with you. I wanted to filter towards data and as much, you know, reliable source of information as possible, because I felt that it was, you know, quite damaging from a mental health point of view. And in speaking to the team, at first they were sort of saying, well, aren't you just sticking your head in the sand? I said, well, I don't think so, because I'm gathering lots of data rather than watching what I think are very, very emotional sort of news stories. But obviously, as it went on, it then started turning to all the business challenges of, you know, the amount of activity we would have. So again, I think we did relatively well to get in touch with our customers at a really early stage, get in touch with our suppliers. One of our biggest products that we manufacture is telematic products for the car insurance industry. And obviously with all the driving test centers closing, there was no young drivers coming through and their market massively reduced. So knowing that was going to happen, we had to sort of get into sort of a bit of emergency planning mode with our client, you know, major clients very, very quickly. But again, luckily that because we built up sort of the relationship where our continued sustainability was as essential to them as they are to us, that we made sure that we put plans in place that would allow us to, you know, to thrive and sustain. Now, that's been extremely uncomfortable as you know, last 18 months. We've gone out and used some of the funding packages that have been made available. So we would probably have been at a point now where we've paid off all of our growth funding, but we've probably put most of that back into the business in terms of the funding required to sort of sustain over the COVID period. But also we moved factory, and you can actually see the picture on the screen. So, you know, we actually picked up the keys to a new factory on the 6th of April 2020. So whilst there's a lot of, you know, other people and organizations that were sort of having to hunker down a bit and work from home, we were actually, you know, highly active and with big projects on the go. And maybe to a degree that initially helped us actually have something to focus on and sort of drive through and drive towards. I remember having an emergency conference call with the board, and my chairman asked for an emergency conference call saying, shall we delay the move by 6 months? And we sort of evaluated it. We said, well, you know, the landlord for our old premises wanted that back, so that was one key driver. But also we kind of asked the question, well, if we wait 6 months and in 6 months time, you know, things start coming back and there's a peak of activity, wouldn't we have preferred to have already moved? And if there is downtime, well, it's probably the best time to move. So, you know, I think it was using systems thinking, and we had a risk register that we were able to use to, you know, evaluate risk and set priorities for what actions we need to take. I suppose, ironically, we're actually still in a very, very tough period with COVID, because we're right in the middle of the supply chain crisis. Being an electronic assembler, we can take hundreds of different components to assemble a product, and if one of those components is missing, we can't even start. So again, we've had to be really, really ahead of the curve, and really highly communicative with all of our suppliers to be able to sort of keep that side going. And touch wood, although we've had some very sort of stressful moments, we seem to be there or thereabouts with, you know, with the supply chain. But in answering your question about the team, there is one individual who's actually been working from home for a large period during COVID, and actually she's just due to go on maternity leave in a couple of months' time. And it is clear, to be honest with you, how having face-to-face communication with team members in the factory, they often say, oh, can you speak to that person about this, and can you ask them about that? And I'm sort of sat there going, no, pick up the phone to them, you know, organize a Zoom. And you do, I think, need to be cognizant of making sure that those individual engagements and that, you know, trust that's built up over that period of time of building that relationship is maintained. And obviously there'll be, you know, a long period again with this individual being on maternity leave. But similarly, we've got another young individual who went on maternity leave at the beginning of this year, is due to come back in December. So we've got a task with that individual of helping them. You know, there's new members of staff that have joined since they went on maternity leave, so making sure that they effectively, you know, reintegrate with the team, and there's, you know, there's good, you know, good relationships and good camaraderie. So I think that there's lots to think about around that space. I know for, you know, businesses like yourselves, you know, working remotely is you probably primarily work remotely for many years anyway. So actually there's a lot that works really well. But obviously from a manufacturing business with, you know, heavy machinery, being co-located is quite critical, and it's quite key as part of the business, and making sure that the service side of the business and the admin and the accounts and side of the business that doesn't necessarily need to be on site all the time still has really good interactions and aren't missing out on any of the communication and the conversations that are going on for the team that are co-located. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges at the moment. But
I think one of the other things that sort of springs to mind with that is, how do you maintain compassionate leadership when, say, an employee's performance is unsatisfactory or not meeting the standards that you require, especially in this current environment?
So it's the same as it always has been for us. I've got a relatively simple measure, which is it fair to the rest of the team? Is that individual's behavior or performance, and if it continues or if it gets worse, is that fair to everyone else? And when you think about it like that, it changes the, you know, it changes the dynamic of the question, really, because they're not doing something about it. And we've had 3 situations where we have had to take action over 10 years. It's uncomfortable. It's not something, you know, that you really like to do. It's not what you thought becoming a leader and a business owner was. You know, you want to build things, you want to design things, you want to be creative, but you can't avoid it. But again, having, you know, specialists and people with experience around you. I'm very lucky I've got an operations manager who's highly experienced, who's, you know, run businesses for, you know, a much longer time period than myself. I've got an HR specialist manager who's highly experienced, who's been through all of these types of processes before, and she understands the assessment requirement. She understands the process, and also it's giving you the opportunity to have people around you that you can bounce off of. You can ask the question, is this fair? Is this appropriate? And in some circumstances, I may feel that I want to be slightly more compassionate than maybe some of my compatriots on the board. They may be slightly less compassionate, but I obviously look these people in the eye every single day. So for me, you do have that element of emotion around those, but having that balance and having that sort of ability to interact. But at the end of the day, if I'm honest, I look back at the situations that we've had to take action on, and I'm quite grateful that we did take those actions, because it would have been quite detrimental to not have dealt with it, and not to actually have to resolved and moved on. There was a very interesting situation I had many years ago with a young member of staff and an experienced member of staff, where really it was a falling out, but it was a falling out which was due to a misunderstanding. I remember having the structure and the team and the HR resource that I have now. I took them into a meeting room, and I saw very, very quickly one of them start to explain their mindset to the other, and the other one to say, well, I agree. And actually, because there had been something that hadn't gone quite right, they were both very frustrated, and they'd kind of taken it out on each other, rather than actually, the end result was that they both had the same passion for the end result, but they didn't understand each other. And once I realized, having been in that meeting room for 2 minutes, that they was kind of on the same page, I just sat there and said, I'm going to leave you two talking about this, because kind of, the fact that you're already working out that you wanted the same thing is, I think, the most. So I'm just going to walk out and let you two get on with it. But the three individuals that we've had to take action and have left the business, it has unfortunately been, well, not unfortunately, it's been for the greater good, but all three of those individuals have thrived outside. So, sometimes, whether it's, we've all been through relationships, unfortunately, that haven't quite worked. And sometimes you have to rip the Band-Aid off and take action. And, again, be honest and be true to yourself, because maybe it is a situation of not being the right person in the right environment. But the obvious thing is that you need to learn from that, and you need to try and build that back into your hiring process, because you got to try not to make this. If it is a mistake, or if it's an individual that hasn't worked out, you're going to try and not repeat that. You can try and because I think everyone is they'll add value somewhere, and if it's not a good fit for your business, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be a good fit for another business. And as I was talking earlier on, right person in the right environment. But if it isn't a good fit, or if it is really, it's not working out, I think, to not take action is the worst thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're dead right. And I think we had recently on the show Niampini Bunda, who is the chief exec for Southern Africa for GE. And he said similarly, it's about having the right people in the right roles, doing the right thing. And he actually used the football analogy of, no football manager's ever signed a bad player. It's just sometimes it doesn't necessarily work out, and you've got to either coach them to fix it or move them on.
Well, it's interesting. I was using almost an identical analogy yesterday. We had a team meeting, and I sort of said, remember when we were a 6 or 7-a-side football team, and we were playing as a 7-a-side football team in what was a game that we felt like we didn't have enough resources for. But we're now, not only we're more than an 11-a-side football team, but we've got to the point where if the centre forward's off on holiday, we've got another centre forward that can play that role and play that role really effectively. But there was definitely a time in the past, whereas we might have put the sub goalie on up front because we didn't have sufficient diverse sort of resource and backup resource, and we hadn't built to the point where we've got cross training and so on and so forth. But you're absolutely right. Getting the right people in the right role and not playing them out of position, is really critical to to getting the right results.
Mm-hmm. What would you say has been the biggest leadership crisis you've faced?
Interesting. I mean, I knew you were going to ask this one, and I had to. This is probably the one that I had to think about quite a bit. And I suppose the answer is we've been through a few, and each one probably felt like it was the biggest, hardest, most challenging situation that we've been through. At every occasion, they were different, but they had, common themes and commonality. But I suppose the one that we've just been going through recently, theoretically, could have been the biggest in our supply chain. We had a point where we thought we were going to be having no more of a single product to the end of the year, and the first thought could be, almost panic, disaster. Could this bring the business down? But what we've developed, which has been really, really helpful to us, is first of all a team that they can cope with uncertainty, they can cope with difficult news and not panic, that we trust each other, that we've been through challenging times before and we'll get through challenging times again. We built that that ability to be transparent and share and not to keep things to ourselves. So getting challenges out first through to the management team, then up to the board, and we have 10 board meetings a year, so nearly every month we've got the opportunity to share. If we've got something that's very, very difficult, then we've got the opportunity to share and to have more heads and more brain power into the challenge. We also have some quite good systems developed, as I mentioned before, a risk register where we evaluate, rather than just worrying, we evaluate what the risk is, what's the likelihood of it, what's the impact, and then using the methodology of kind of multiplying those 2 out of 5 measures together, then allowing us to prioritize of all the risks that we see in front of us, which ones do we need to take urgent and immediate action, which ones can we slightly deprioritize, or so you can start to kind of step through on a systems basis what's in front of you, and then start to lay out a plan. And again, going out to whether it's your customers and your clients or your suppliers, and starting to kind of really again share and let them know the impact of something happening and how it's going to impact on yourself. And actually, quite quickly we found with most of the crises that we've been through that kind of trusting your team and your board, and trusting your suppliers and your customers, and once you kind of shared those what the problems are, you can start to commonly come out with solutions. And we've got a really interesting situation at the moment where of a product that requires 252 different components, we've got 251 of them. It happens that there's another manufacturer that supplies to our client that produces the same product, and they've also got 251 out of the 252 components. The one that they don't have at the moment is available on the market in such a massive premium, they could make a killing, an absolute killing, out of selling that component on the secondary market. But we've got together with the client, through the client, to have what the client described, and I'm not sure it's the best way of describing it, they've described it as a hostage exchange, that we've actually sold to them some of the components that we have that they need, in return for them sending to us or selling to us the components we need that they have. And in doing that, we've made sure that the client doesn't get to a point where it's letting down its customers, that ultimately could blow up the entire situation for all companies. Because if the end client isn't being serviced, ultimately, the deal might fall through, and that's it. Product's not going to get manufactured anymore. So I think, being sensible and thinking, through, well, what's the end outcome? Who else can be engaged in helping resolve? So actually, our competitor has been quite critical to help resolve the crisis. Just so happened they had the same crisis as we did, that we could help them resolve. So you never know actually where these solutions will come from. And that wasn't one of the first items that went up on the list of things that would be part of the solution. But by sharing it with the client and suppliers and so on, it became actually one of the critical elements of solving it. So yeah, interesting.
Okay. I guess I've asked most of the questions I wanted to ask today, Oli. I think the one that I ask everyone as well is, as we're at the end of the interview, is there a question I haven't asked that you would ask if you were the interviewer?
Wow. I don't know, actually. I know that one of the questions that you've asked to other interviewees is, what are the leadership qualities that are overrated? And I suppose for me, I'd say, don't make the mistake of thinking you have to be the smartest person in the room. Leadership isn't about doing everything yourself or trying to be the hero. It's about gathering together a group of people, motivating them, incentivizing them, commonly making sure that you're all with the same objective, you've got the same ambitions, and then basically helping to point everyone in the same direction, and understanding what the milestones of the objectives need to be. And you don't have to necessarily always lead from the front. And if you can, get to the point where you're trusting of others, actually, you can kind of invert the pyramid and not have to be the person that's perceived to be at the top, and almost be the person at the bottom, sort of, looking up. And we try and do that as much as possible. We try and encourage as many of the team as possible to take initiative, to join in, to take responsibility. So again, I sort of think a little bit of The Apprentice and Dragon's Den. I think they give out completely the wrong message. It isn't about finding the strongest, toughest, fastest. I don't think that's the game. I think the game is trying to be a bit humble and trying to find other good people and trusting them, and maybe getting out of the way a little bit so that they can shine. I suppose for me, that's pretty much what it's all about.
Okay, Oli, well, thank you for your insights today, and thank you very much for joining us on the show.
No problem. Thank you for that.